Okay, let's talk about financing, and actually, to be more specific, this is about financing infrastructure and public facilities related to TOD. And it's one of the draft white papers. One that's sometimes used is surplus public agency lands, whether it used to be redevelopment lands or transit agency lands or other government lands that are near transit stations, surplus lands. Also parcels that are already assembled for obsolete commercial and light industrial uses. And that's probably the area that a lot of cities and developers are seeing as more of an opportunity, particularly with changes in the retail market nationally and demand for the old shopping centers. Many of them are being reused as a mixture or mixed-use development. CNU calls it gray fields. And I think there's an estimate of 200 to 400 obsolete regional malls around the country that are being eyed as possibilities for introducing transit and mixed use. We have our own example with the Uptown project in Hillcrest, which was the obsolete 14-acre Sears site. Small parcels to assemble, because there are economies for assembling parcels and provides design flexibility, and so that's another opportunity in order to create parcels that are developable. But there's a downside sometimes in some communities that parcel size character creates a characteristic to that community that people value as opposed to the larger project. One of the interesting things that isn't talked about as much is the adaptive reuse of buildings that are near transit. Pearl District is a good example of that, of old warehouse buildings that also could be reused for a mixture of uses serviceable by transit. Incremental development on small parcels. I think San Ysidro has been looking at an idea of a small lot approach or small lot zoning to take, and LA has done this as well, is taking that 5,000 square foot lot and subdividing it so it might provide housing for 3 or 4 families. Single family, but they would still be either attached or small lot or row housing. And then, of course, transit access to existing development, especially to try to address some of the greenhouse gas emission goals and objectives. It's not just about building new, it's also providing access to the existing building stock and population and workforce that live and work in those buildings. Research has also shown that compact development uses infrastructure more efficiently. So as taxpayers, this is a consideration. 1 mile of pipe to service land that's at 4 units an acre versus 1 mile of pipe servicing land that's at 20 units an acre, you get more use of that piece of infrastructure in a more compact form of development. And sometimes there's lower long-term maintenance and operating costs per capita because of the ability to service more people, more units, more workplaces, more homes in a compact environment. An example would be public safety, to make a call to a certain address, and if that address has multiple homes and workplaces there, that's more efficient than driving to one parcel at a time in a more suburban environment. Consequently, research has shown that TODs produce half as many automobile trips, and some of the trip generation rates that are being used might be overstated when you're in a location that's serviceable by transit. The implication of that is that as a region grows, fewer lane miles are needed, less right-of-way purchase is needed, and less parking per capita is needed. So there are fiscal or economic incentives that come with more compact forms of development. The trade-off is it's a different lifestyle, and some people aren't willing to make that trade-off. So infrastructure, what's the need? There's the capacity for the new growth, There's also existing deficits in many of these communities where TOD is existing or planned. And it's no fault because we really didn't have financing mechanisms for providing public facilities in those neighborhoods for the neighborhoods that were built before the 1970s or 1980s, which is maybe 60% or 2/3 of our building stock. They just didn't do it in the 20s or the 30s or the 40s or 50s and 60s. And also standards have changed since those times. And just think of a lot of the, what I call the GI Bill communities we have in San Diego, Serra Mesa where I grew up, or Linda Vista, or Kearny Mesa, Claremont. Those areas were built without the amenities of the planned communities of the 1980s and 1990s, but also without that compact form that you see in the pre-World War II communities, such as the neighborhoods, bungalow communities in Mid-City and surrounding Balboa Park and in South Bay. Financing infill infrastructure is a challenge, as Mia pointed out. It often involves many entities, particularly if you have a lot of property owners to provide in a district. To get a lot of property owners together to decide on the same thing is very difficult. Community concerns about impacts on existing facilities. What impact will this new growth have to our parks that already exist, our schools? The new infrastructure can be more difficult than for infill development than greenfield development, as was pointed out, that even though it might be more efficient once built, if you're having to rebuild infrastructure and tear out the streets, rebuild it, it's more an old 60, 80, 90-year-old infrastructure. It's more challenging and can be more costly than just building a pipe on virgin land. Planning standards has their consequences. Many of our planning standards, if we actually were to build them out, we as taxpayers could never afford them if we were to build them out, but we know we never get to that point. And so, particularly in the existing and older communities. Parks is a good example where many communities have a park standard based on acres per thousand population. And while in a suburban environment, greenfield development, it's very easy to provide that 2.8, 3, 4 acres per thousand, 5 acres per thousand population, like Otay Ranch in Chula Vista. But in an urban environment, it's very hard to do because you can't find that land without displacing a lot of people. Now, some cities have been creative and they've taken some of their street right-of-way and closed them and turned them into linear parks or series of pocket parks. We call them the deconstructed parks, of a lot of different parks that together serve the same purpose as a neighborhood or community park, but they're within walking distance of each other in an area. The Orange Line in Boston, I think, was a good example of that. Also, affordable housing's capacity to absorb financing costs is limited. A lot of the jurisdictions in California, and especially in this region because of growth management set up in the 70s and 80s, finance new growth through impact fees. And in some contexts and suburban development, they can absorb the impact fees. But with affordable housing, they're already operating at a deficit and gap financing. So adding an additional cost, such as impact fees, it can't be absorbed by the land. The land's already a negative value. So it just increases the outside gap financing or subsidy that's needed to make that feasible. So the case for a TOD financing strategy, because with these constraints, it makes it very challenging. There's the scale challenge, the multiple property owners. And unlike let's say a greenfield area like Santa Fe Valley here in the northern part of the county in the 90s, or now Otay Mesa in San Diego, there's a mechanism where even if you have a few property owners, a large property owner can go ahead and build, put in the infrastructure, and then get reimbursed over time as the other properties develop through some type of reimbursement agreement. And because it's of a large enough scale, they have the capacity to do that or get the financing to do that. In urban infill environments, parcels are smaller, opportunities are smaller, and more often than not, individual projects just have it's a limited capacity and less time to absorb those kinds of costs or put in place a financing mechanism on their own to finance those needs, while in a greenfield environment, they might have the incentive to do that. So financing capacity of a district overall can also become a challenge, particularly if you're putting in new infrastructure, not just for the new development, but while you're doing it, you're upgrading the infrastructure for the existing community, the existing population. There's the authorization challenge. Many mechanisms in California require some form of public vote, whether it's an assessment district and property owners, which could be a action and then a challenge to a type of vote, or whether it's a community facilities district, a special tax district, which as a special tax requires 2/3 in California right now. There's certain facilities that are 55%, schools, for example, but much of them still, if it's for a special purpose, requires a 2/3 challenge. And when you see some of the examples around in other parts of the country, one of the reasons they're able to get that voter support is because they don't have to get a 2/3 vote to pass it. It's just a simple majority. Also, there's the benefit nexus for assessments and fee-based mechanisms. Fee-based mechanisms, let's say for parking, state law requires that to be called a fee, the revenue has to be used for the purpose that benefits the payers of the fee. If it's not, then it's a tax. And if it's a tax, then it requires a vote. And if it's a vote, it requires 2/3. So you can see how that provides some constraints where fee-based revenue can only go for what is being paid for with that fee to benefit the payers of those fees. And then the benefit nexus assessment requires that you make that nexus connection, that this benefit will improve these properties or have benefit to these properties, and there's a whole industry of assessment engineers who do those kinds of calculations, but they can be challenged over time. Conditions might change, or they may question the calculation. There's the demise of redevelopment, which is a major source of affordable housing, a mechanism for assembling properties or underwriting the cost of land. And then there's this issue of pay-go versus debt financing and timing. Pay-go is, as you collect the revenue, you wait till you get enough money and then you pay to make the improvement. Impact fees often work that way, is that you wait till you get enough money and then you make the improvement. However, the demand for the infrastructure that's needed occurs from day one when development starts to occur. So there's a period there where you have this lag between when you can actually finance an improvement versus when that improvement's needed. And that can be a challenging situation, or at worst, create a backlash in a community when they see the impacts without the benefits because they're not able to wait for those benefits. Debt financing allows to get the money up front, to get those improvements in place concurrent with the growth. However, there's a cost to debt financing, and the tools are more limited. So different funding sources that are potential and also have been used in places around the country. One of the things we've noticed is that because California had such a powerful tool with California redevelopment, there was a tendency to really rely on that tool and not to use the other tools as much as maybe other states did or do that didn't have the types of redevelopment that we had in California. That's no longer the case. So it's important that we learn from these other places around the country. One is user fees. And again, user fees financing improvements. Parking is a good example. Now, some cities have taken that further and said, okay, it's not just a parking district where the money has to go towards parking improvements, but maybe parking is part of a mobility district. And so part of the eligible uses of that money is to help subsidize TDM, transit passes, streetscape improvements for pedestrians, bicycle links, because it's an overall mobility district. We're not sure if that would pass legal muster in California right now as the law is passed, but maybe it requires a change in the law. Development impact fees and exactions, which people here are very familiar with. It's the source. I discussed the issues there. Benefit assessment districts, often can be used to maintain the streetscape improvements or do some of the modest pedestrian and streetscape improvements that create that walkable environment. Business improvement districts, and you'll see some examples where bids have been used to help subsidize the cost of putting in circulators and transit linkages for that first and last mile. General revenue, which is great if you can get the public there. It only requires a 50% vote plus one, but there's no guarantee what the money is going to go for. So voters in California have been reluctant to approve those kinds of taxes. Tax increment financing, our redevelopment was one. It was a very powerful tool. There's some other forms of tax increment financing that we'll discuss, one of which is the new Enhanced Infrastructure Financing District, which just came into law January 1st. And then there's equity and public-private partnerships. Dina talked about some of those with the equity funds in Denver and the Bay Area. There are other examples that weren't specifically for TOD, but it was related, such as the foundations creating an investment fund for revitalizing downtown Cincinnati that also has transit service associated with it, or the Cortex in an urban biotech district in St. Louis. Federal and state grants, various grants you've heard about, from the federal government and the state government, the HUD grants, but those come and go, and they're competitive. And actually, the grant fund is a very large fund, but when you actually divide it by all the different folks demanding and applying for the fund, often the amount per grant is not that great, but it's helpful. Some cities have used their own general funds, part of their general taxes, to help get TOD started, and you'll see some examples there. Philanthropy and nonprofits I mentioned, the debt financing, value capture I'll get into, land banks, some nonprofits and foundations and community development organizations have formed land banks to secure land for the reasons that people mentioned earlier in the discussion about affordable housing. Infrastructure banks, there's talk about one from the federal government. It's one area where there's bipartisan discussion of it. If that's ever going to happen, we'll see. The state also has infrastructure banks, but isn't used as much as you think it might, and so there may be some opportunities to improve those as a source. And then the general CIP prioritization. Many cities, including the city of San Diego, has a process for prioritizing their CIP investments each year for capital improvements. TOD could be a factor in that prioritization process, and some cities have done that, some cities haven't. So there's an opportunity there. So the enhanced IFD, which was to help replace the increment from that was lost with redevelopment, took effect January 1st. It can be adopted by a city council or county board. There's a low mod housing set aside. It's for transit priority projects and infrastructure to implement a region's sustainable community strategy. It can fund environmental remediation and revives the Polanco Act, which was used by redevelopment to help deal with brownfield issues. And it can fund other TOD improvements. However, it just started, right? So it's going to be a while before the tax increment actually grows to a sizable amount where you can do a lot of meaningful things. Although there might be individual projects that can use it on a project-based IFD. They can issue bonds with the same voting rules as community facility districts. There's a 45-year window, and can be combined with the community facilities district or benefit assessment district. So there's a source of funding to pay for capital and a source of funding to pay for other public amenities and oh, your note, 2 minutes? Okay. So I'm going to ignore Matt. And, okay, I set the time. Okay, and then the tax, but the tax districts have to consent to participate, and that's typically the city and the county, maybe some of the special districts, but not the school districts. And for any local jurisdiction to set it up, they have to ask themselves the question, we're giving up tax increment for capital improvements that otherwise would come into our operating budget, our general funds, to pay for our operations and services. So it's something to consider. There's also the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program, also new. It's using cap and trade funds in the state and allocated by the Strategic Growth Council, again, for TOD-related improvements. So one approach is the value capture, and this is just a concept to think about, is if TOD does create value, and if this public investment in transit and public amenities that go with it creates value, can some of that value be captured back to help financing? And it gets back to this notion of residual land value. You have the market sets the price. The market demand sets the price for whatever you're developing. And in that, you have profit, you have your building costs, your soft costs, infrastructure, prep costs, and the residual is, after a given rate of return, what a developer could afford to spend for land in order to realize that profit and attract the capital needed to make the investment. And part of the factors that influence value is entitlement. And with a lift in entitlement, there potentially could be a lift in the residual land value. And then that lift, some jurisdictions have said, let's capture a portion of it to help finance the improvements that help create that lift in value. And there are various sources, not just entitlements, that influence the demand and the value of real estate. So it's something to consider. It's not just entitlements. If the market's not there, you could give it all the entitlements you want. The value is still going to be low, not reflecting the entitlements because the market's not there. Vancouver is an example of a city, okay, it's Canadian, but at least it's in North America, but different constitutional laws, so do keep that in mind. But their approach actually could be tailored, and there are examples in the U.S. where it's been tailored in the U.S. in Santa Monica or in Arlington, Virginia, and other places. But basically saying, okay, well, each project, we have a base that's by right, and then if you want to exercise more, you can by the plan and by the policy, but a portion of that lift in value has to come back to make improvements identified and informed by policy. So it's not just arbitrary. But it is a negotiated agreement process for that extra lift in value and what comes back to fund improvements. So there has to be some kind of regulatory framework and the expertise on both sides of the table to negotiate, and therefore it has to be transparent because the ultimate approval of the negotiation is a public hearing. And this is in addition to their impact fees, which they call development cost levies. So it's not for just your general public improvements or amenities, it's for extraordinary public improvements and amenities, maybe ones that that benefit more than just the property, that benefit the broader community. So when does value capture work best? When market demand exists for the bonus. By right entitlement is less than the market for the site. Extraordinary benefits are defined and valued by policy ordinance, and there's that capability to negotiate on both sides. Again, transparent, and also that there's not a significant cost penalty to exercise that additional entitlement. So, for example, if you were to go from a 5-story building to a 10-story building, you'd say, "Oh, great! I doubled my entitlement." But that increase in entitlement might put you into a higher cost of construction, a different construction type. If you have high parking ratios, it might require multiple levels of underground parking. And if those cost burdens exceed the benefit, then a developer wouldn't have the incentive to participate in the program. So keys to private participation: must be enough private value. There has to be motivation more than just transit. But developers need the transit to support impacts of growth, and need to have enough development rights to cover the exactions. And now we'll just mention a few examples from our other speakers.
All right, so this is the Tysons, Virginia, formerly known as Tysons Corner. So part of that capturing value was rebranding what it is. And it's a, as I mentioned before, it's a very large employment center, and it got bigger because it stole one of your headquarters, SAIC, so they thank you for that. And here it was about, as the previous slide said, scaling the entitlement to the scale that would help pay for the development, but also would respect what the neighbors were willing to put up with. Tysons today is 46 million square feet, 120,000 jobs. Since the zoning was enacted, there's been development approvals for 30 million square feet of new development. So that's growing it by 2/3, and that's just in 3 years of entitlements, and a lot of that is under construction. So, you know, it's a big scale thing. Oops. So the paying for it comes from a few things. Developer payments plus public finance. So there's extractions. They use a different word for it called proffers. There's tax increment. And then the thing I wanted to talk about most, there's 2 assessment districts. And those assessment districts are, you know, mind-boggling numbers. $650 million being paid for by assessments. So the first assessment was in 2004, and it is for $400 million, and it's to help pay for the 4 metro stations, heavy rail stations that are in Tysons Corner, and the developers agreed to do that and assess themselves. And then the second assessment district put into place is $250 million to pay for a grid of streets, so an urban street system, and then a whole series of urban amenities, parks, open space, and affordable housing. And so those are in place today and being collected. 2 other general fund examples of one from Portland and one from the Twin Cities, both operated by their MPO, so, you know, a SANDAG kind of thing. And in Portland, the Metro TOD program, which Dina mentioned, there are 100% grants to development projects that are mixed use and or near transit. They will pay for things like site acquisition, what they call urban living infrastructure. So those are the kind of things that make you want to live in a mixed-use place, and that's a longer conversation. And then technical assistance. Since 1998, they've invested $40 million on 31 development projects, and they've leveraged $9.7 million in direct investment and $528 million in development activity. What they're trying to do here is to kind of continue to move the market. They get about $5.5 to $6 million every 2 years for the program, and it's all in local funds. Then in the Twin Cities, they have an MPO TOD grant program for developers. The caveat there is the developer has to apply through a city, so a little bit like the grants that are here. And that's enabled by their Livable Communities Act. It's within places that have transit within a half mile or transit operating by 2020. The grants are to further TOD implementation. And similar to Portland, but slightly different, they fund site assembly, placemaking, energy efficiency, and publicly accessible infrastructure. This year, they've granted $6.5 million in grants. And again, the funding for that one is also 100% local funds. And one of the reasons why you want local funds is that you don't get all the federal strings, which is not a good thing.
I'll just mention this one. This is South Lake Union, which is next to downtown Seattle, and it's a mixed-use technology, institutional, residential district. Originally was set up as a biotech district, but with the University of Washington Biotech Center and the Hutchinson Cancer Research Center. But Amazon decided to move their headquarters there. And so Amazon is building their headquarters in an urban, mixed-use environment because they feel it's important for the talent they need for their workforce. The Gates Foundation is nearby, and it's serviced and connected to downtown by a 2.6-mile streetcar with 11 stops. And talking to the economic development folks there and the developer, they felt that streetcar connection was very important for them to position it for economic development. Before, it was kind of a light industrial, strip retail, second tertiary zone, I guess, of Seattle. The streetcar, 50% of it's financed by a property-based business improvement district put in place by the property owners there. And I think in Seattle, generally, the voters put in place, they decided to tax themselves to like a special tax mechanism to help subsidize transit costs in the city to encourage a better level of service and more frequent service. And you can see how the streetcar funding is put in place. The local district, instead of a bid, they call it a lid, providing a share, but then that local share leverages federal dollars and state dollars, as well as surplus properties that they've used. So anytime you use local funds, to the extent you can leverage other funds, then you can have a greater impact. Transbay Terminal in San Francisco, this is where high-speed rail is planned to end up in San Francisco. And it's a multimodal center, so for high speed, but also the rest of the transit system. And on top of it is a rooftop urban park that creates an amenities. As you can imagine, San Francisco being, I think it's the most densely populated city in North America, lacks that urban open space. And so the opportunity to provide it, they saw here was related to transit. And that they know that creates a value for the adjacent properties. And so they upzoned the adjacent properties, but they said you can't exercise all of that extra entitlement unless you participate in a community facilities district, a special tax district, to help pay for the park and its maintenance. And so that's an example of value enhancement through public investment, but capturing some of the value back to finance that public investment. And then we have Denver.
We'll always have Denver. I'm going to show you two infill TOD examples at large scale. They're infill in every sense of the word, but they're big district scale. One is Denver Union Station and the surrounding lands, and one is a project called Assembly Square that I worked on in Boston. I'm lucky enough to work on Union Station as well. One thing I want to say about these two, and also Transbay and Tysons, these are big. They're uniquely big in their own regions. They'd be uniquely big in this region. And you should not say to yourself, well, this can't possibly apply to what I'm trying to do in my city because they're so big and simply of a different scale. They're of a different scale, but the kinds of mechanisms that we're talking about tailored to scale and to California law would work just fine, or we wouldn't be taking your time with them. Denver Union Station, you heard a lot about it before. It's a tremendous 5-region hub, and it's both the core of the Fast Tracks expansion that Peter talked about. This occurred when he was city planning director. And there's 1.35 million square feet of development directly on the 19.5-acre publicly owned site that was procured in conjunction with the transit project itself. And there's 15 or 20 additional acres immediately adjacent in a very hot development location, some of that owned by the same developers who constitute the joint venture, who were selected as master developers. So there's a tremendous energy and just capacity to capture some of that market. The key was, in the first instance, how to pay for the station. The station, you can see from the number behind me, in all of its aspects, is about a $500 million project, only about half of which was funded by normal public means, the special sales tax referendum that paid for fast tracks. That and some federal grants together amounted for about half, and the question was how to come up with the other half. And the way they came up with the other half was in large measure for the development to pay for it. And that was a combination of purchasing the joint development parcels, the 5 parcels on the 19.5 acre public site. The developers over time paid a present value of $35 million for that, by no means half of the cost, but a good chunk of change. And then another, about $150 million, was a federal loan backed by tax increment financing, and Colorado has a form of special assessment district called the Metro District. Nothing really Metro about it, that's just what it's called. And those two things rolled into this federal low-interest loan, accounted for another $150 million. And between those two things and a little of this and a little of that, the $477 million cost of the transit component was paid for. Yeah, I think I told you everything on the second slide. Assembly Square is a brownfield located close to downtown Boston. It's in the city of Somerville, but if you know Boston at all, very close to downtown Boston, about 2 miles. An old brownfield called Assembly Square because it was a Ford assembly plant a long time ago. Extraordinary location. Lots of political momentum and lots of developer interest, blocked over a period of time by community groups in Somerville and Cambridge who were not anti-development, who did not want this to be a low-density, big-box development, who wanted it to be higher-density TOD mixed use, and they actually not only lobbied successfully, but litigated successfully for that outcome, and everyone agreed. The problem was it couldn't be TOD because our orange line went right through it but didn't have a station. So it needed 2 things. It needed a station, which turned out to cost $56 million, and it needed the same kind of district infrastructure, the grid of streets and sidewalks and utilities and drainage and open space that turns 65 acres of abandoned, scraped brownfield into a TOD district, the same kind of thing that GB described at Tysons, we needed here. And all of that was paid for in one way or another by capturing the value of the development. The station was paid for from a number of sources, but critically, the first $15 million of that 56 was front-ended by the developer, which meant that he was not only paying for a share of the construction, but all of the pre-development costs, from putting the magic marker blob on the map to having construction documents ready for bid. Every dollar of that was paid for upfront with private funds, which meant that the whole time we were chasing after the remaining public funds to build the station, that didn't have to wait a second for lack of funding. And that just, it goes far beyond what percentage 15 is of 56. I mean, that was what made this thing happen. The $125 million of infrastructure grid was paid for through 2 different forms of tax increment, mostly. Traditional municipal TIF by the city of Somerville for about 25, and then $50 million of it, excuse me, I brought a little bit of the blizzard with me. $50 million of it was our first use of a brand new program in Massachusetts that captures the state tax increment from the sales and income taxes, which are purely state taxes in Massachusetts, into this complicated, special revenue bond, you can ask me the details if you're intrigued by it during the Q&A. But that's $50 million in which the developer has skin in the game. During that lag period Bill described, the developer pays the debt service and doesn't get paid back for it, and then the project goes into service, and the State Development Agency pays the debt service from that captured value for the incremental taxes. But that meant that no general public funds at all, and for that $50 million, and no funds from the developer other than the not insignificant cost of the front-end debt service during construction. And the result is, between those two things and a little of this and a little of that, you get $125 million of infrastructure grid, and you're ready to go. And again, big in scale, but you can readily imagine those kinds of mechanisms being adapted to a 15-acre district or a 20-acre district. Thanks.
Also, there are examples of private participation in parks, because what's common in infill development is actually impact fees per unit tend to be lower than greenfield development. I recall in the city of San Diego, the impact fees for infill neighborhoods range from $4,000 to, let's say, $15,000 a unit, and most were in that $8,000 to $12,000 range. The impact fees for the greenfield development range from, I guess, the high 30s to as high as $120,000 a unit, and most in the high 40s to $60,000 a unit. And the reason is in the greenfield, they're having to finance all of their infrastructure. While in urban infill, there's often, especially street capacity, that allows without having to pay for new streets. But you do have the underground utilities to be concerned about, and also probably the bigger driver of impact fees, at least in urban neighborhoods in the city of San Diego, was the park requirement. And there are examples of private development funding the parks and funding to maintain the parks as well in order to create the value around them. And plus, one of the reasons they want to be responsible for maintaining and operating the park is they want to make sure the park's secure and maintained at a certain standard to support the development that they're building around it. So examples of Post Office Square in Boston, Clyde Warren Park, which is a freeway deck park in downtown Dallas, and Grand Park in Los Angeles, which used to be it's by the Music Center and City Hall, but used to be a pretty derelict part of downtown Los Angeles. So, end with some ideas to consider just to start the conversation on financing. And tomorrow we're going to spend more time really having that conversation on actions for the TOD strategy. But because of these challenges related to financing, one of the ideas is, what if we had a regional TOD special district? So rather than trying to solve it one TOD at a time, look at either the whole system or maybe certain lines of the system or large segments of the system as a discontiguous TOD district. And I stole that from Lance Schulte, who pitched it to me as an idea 6 years ago. The CFD, Community Facilities District, might be a mechanism that could enable that to happen. If it's fewer than 12 property owners, it's a vote by property owner based on acreage. You could imagine, let's say, Mission Valley doing something like that. If it's larger, then it's a vote of the voters, the people. However, there aren't too many examples of CFD being used in that way, even though on the books you could. There are more jurisdictions starting to look at it as a mechanism for financing urban infill development and their facility needs. So you would be at the cutting edge. But if you had one set up, like San Francisco's mechanism, it could be a mechanism where property owners who are building TOD could choose to opt in to the CFD, amending the CFD as they opt in, or a city could condition a property if they want enhanced entitlements to participate in the CFD. So we're just suggesting maybe it's something to explore. We're not sure it's working, if it would work, But also part of this is, if it doesn't quite work now under existing law, should part of the strategy be to propose some legislative changes in Sacramento to enable it to work. The Enhanced Infrastructure Financing Districts is on the books, brand new. A lot of places are looking at how to incorporate it in companion with a regional district. The Public-Private TOD Investment Fund, San Diego Housing Commission and Civic San Diego are looking into that right now. That could be a private companion with these other mechanisms for public facilities. Leveraging the different state funding grants and local funding grants for TOD areas and the green cap and trade dollars at the state level to tee up to position and compete for those funds. Prioritize active transportation grants. SANDAG has a good chunk of their budget for active transportation. And can that be prioritized to service that first and last mile connection issue for TODs? Give it some priority. Is that something that the SANDAG board would be willing to consider in their ranking system? Prioritize TODs in the local CIP processes of the member jurisdictions for general public facility improvements. That's, of course, going to be a discussion in each city, and they have their own different set of circumstances and priorities. But if they are serious about developing TOD, you also do have priorities with your general funds and CIP dollars. And then tailor the planning standards for TOD areas. If general planning standards are part of the problem in how they drive costs and maybe aren't really the right strategy for providing that kind of service to people who live in that kind of environment, such as parks, tailor standards that fit the context and maybe provide it in a better way. Maybe SANDAG or some jurisdictions can develop some model approaches for that, so not every jurisdiction in the region has to reinvent the wheel. The triple bottom line approach to stormwater mitigation, we didn't talk about that too much, but it's at length in the white paper Bob wrote about. And with the changes in state law, stormwater, each property has to retain the stormwater impact so as not to provide incremental impact. Well, that's tough for small properties. So there's opportunities in TOD districts because it's compact development to maybe have amenities that are also stormwater facilities that service the multiple district and leverage each other. And what we call triple bottom line analysis, I'll use San Diego River would be a good example of a green belt, has some stormwater functions with it, but also as a stormwater function and a green belt, there's an opportunity to build a linear park along it. And in that linear park, there could be a trail system. And that trail system for walking and biking, if it's in an urban environment, could also be part of the circulation system. And so you're taking one piece of amenity or facility serving multiple public purposes, and then that's a more efficient use of the public dollar to provide those services. And reflect that in your impact fees. Use the RTP funds as an incentive for matched local funding. If you want that streetcar, or your property owner is willing to assess themselves to a business improvement district, as in Seattle and Union Lake, to finance at least a portion of that transit improvement. Are they willing to use TDM to help service that improvement and generate demand for it? Maybe prepare a model value capture zoning for transit priority areas that jurisdictions can take and modify for their particular circumstances, but consider using based on some of the examples around the country. Again, that's maybe a different approach than Denver did with the form context code. One of the questions we had is there a way to blend the two where there's form context but also have some performance zoning to pay for some extraordinary public improvements? Consider an urban transit service district. Instead of parking districts, make them mobility districts where the revenues collected can be used for different types of mobility. One of the problems of a parking district, if you're a parking district and all your revenue comes from parking, what are you going to do if you're an executive of a parking district? you want to build more parking, right? Because you'll get more revenue. So if it's part of a mobility district where you're looking at other mechanisms as well, it aligns your interests with the broader interests of mobility choices. And then allow the smart growth incentive plan grants to be used, and they may be already, I'm not sure, but to develop financing strategies because of how critical financing is in order to implement TOD and its public facility and infrastructure needs. So with that, that's the financing discussion.
Okay, we have time for just one or two questions.
I did have a bake sale. That was the other option, but
Yes.
cookies in the back. Yeah, $10 each. Okay.
The biggest transit improvement in California right now is the Metropolitan Transit Authority in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
They did a sales tax, the voters approved it, and they're spending billions. I didn't see that on your list.
Well, that's the general, and Transnet is a sales tax overage, so we have it here as well, and we got the 2/3. When was it put in place? 2000. It was extended in 2004, so it's here. LA went for a larger amount. God bless them that they got the vote to do it, and they're going out again. I think what's more interesting is the Seattle example of a the voters agreeing to tax themselves to subsidize transit for better service, subsidizing the operating costs side of it. Also, LA did the, what do you call it, the 3010 program, where they borrowed their federal transit dollars that they're allocated for the next 30 years to get it up front. And you all may know the details of that better than I do, but that was another innovation that they did in LA, which is why a lot of innovative transit-oriented development is now in planning and implementation phases in Los Angeles. I know we're reluctant to look to Los Angeles often for examples. There's a lot of interesting things going on in LA. Any other questions? Back there?
I just think it's interesting to point out that in the 90s, in the South Lake Union area, the city of Seattle voted against taxing themselves to turn it into a park, but they were willing to vote to tax themselves and turn it into a great urban neighborhood. It's
Yeah,
just very interesting.
It is interesting, and also I think different votes changes in time, yeah, that's just an interesting aspect of how things do change over time. One of the things I do remember, in fact, I think somebody at the city, I asked when I was at the city to research this, I was curious how large was the Bay Area when the voters agreed to tax themselves to finance BART in the early 60s? It was the same, the counties that voted it in equaled San Diego County's population today. So there is sometimes a time and place to introduce transit.
And I think this is our final question.
Okay, final question.
Hey, Bill.
Hey.
So there's been talks recently in San Diego of an infrastructure bond for 2016. Have you taken a look at that and seen if there's emphasis towards TODs or TODs, as well as any other good examples in the United States of citywide?
Yeah, that's a broader bond. No, that's a good point. It's on our to-do list. We've had preliminary conversations with SANDAG, but that's also trying to deal with a lot of other quality of life measures. And SANDAG staff are here, but that's certainly one of the conversations we'll be having.
Okay. Thank you, Bill.
Okay. Well,
Dina,
thanks, and the
Al,
cookies are over
GB?
there.